Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Yesterday, we covered the ground vehicles in the suggestions past the developers of October 2024, but there was a vehicle that I missed out because I feel like it's one which deserves its own video. It's the WZ-141. This vehicle is actually really cool, from China, and designed around a lot of the same premises that we actually see from other nations around the time. So we're going to go through its history and also how it's designed. Generally, I think it's really cool, so hopefully you enjoy it too. As always, if you enjoy this type of content, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. In the 1960s, relations between China and its northern neighbor became increasingly strained, culminating in the Zhenbao Island conflict in 1969. Although tensions have eased since the conflict, it cannot be ignored that the Soviet Union was still eyeing northern China. Once the conflict resumed, the Soviet armored clusters would flow through the Chinese border defenses and then go inland. In the face of such a grim situation, China launched several projects to improve its anti-tank capabilities, including the 122 tank project, the 302 anti-tank missile project, and so on. These projects were all army-led, anti-armor, and also anti-cluster capabilities, which would also focus on passive defense. However, at this time, there was still a certain offensive and passive weapon project, which was the WZ-141 double-barreled airborne combat vehicle, which dominated the ground forces projects. Under the threat of the Soviet armored torrent, the airborne forces proposed to design an airborne combat vehicle which would have powerful anti-armor firepower, and therefore could be power-dropped behind enemy lines during wartime and basically slow down the advance of the enemy armored forces, but could also be used in a way to give the advantage of firepower to then cut off the supply line and create conditions for a counterattack. So tracing back to the source of this, such airborne tactics were also partly influenced by the Soviet Union's airborne combat theory, which was characterized by the need for equipment with strong firepower and also high flexibility. So from the 11th of April to the 23rd in 1975, there was a symposium on the development of armored forces which was held in Nanjing. The meeting affirmed the armored light cavalry tactics proposed by the airborne forces by fighting behind enemy lines, which was discussed and preliminarily decided on the project of developing light airborne combat vehicles, and conducted joint experiments with new models such as anti-tank missile launchers in the future. In October of the same year, at a meeting of the Central Military Commission on Weapons and Equipment in Beijing, this concept was further developed, and 4 key requirements for airborne combat vehicles were determined. Number 1 was excellent strategic mobility. The compact size had to be convenient for air transportation, and the weight of the body took into account the upper limit of 22,000 kilos for the main transport aircraft at the time, which was the AN-12. When fighting on the ground, the weight should also be controlled to the point that there is no need for a special tank transporter for transportation, and it should be limited to the load range of ordinary trucks. Number 2 was good off-road performance. Considering that the future combat environment was the 3 North regions, Northeast China, North China, and also Northwest, this vehicle must have excellent off-road performance. Similarly, in order to seize strategic points and also fight and withdraw quickly, it is necessary to ensure the high-speed performance on highways. Number 3 was powerful firepower and survivability. The vehicle had to be able to hit the frontal armor of the T-55, T-62, the main tanks of the Soviet Union, and then also on top of that, it had to have armor protection against small arms and artillery shell fragments. Also, number 4 was vehicleization. In a series of self-developed tank projects, the Army's experience was to carry out generalization and vehicle families, and such excellent experience should also be developed into projects for the airborne forces. So in the future, the development of airborne self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, airborne personnel carriers, and so on the chassis should also be considered. So by December of 1977, The first prototype had been built and was given the designation WZ-141, and even by the standards of the mid-70s, the power of the 105mm recoilless rifles looked outdated, and to combat Soviet tanks, new weapons were needed. The WZ-141 also had an HJ-73 anti-tank missile, which was mounted on top of each of the two guns, with an armor-piercing thickness of more than 500mm, a range of 3 kilometers, and a low profile that was enough to cope with the combat environment at the time. In addition to the 2 standby shells mounted on the turret, there were also 2 spare missiles in the vehicle itself. After the design was completed, the prototype was sent to the test site for preliminary testing. The results of the experiment can only be described as so-so. The results of the test of protection effectiveness showed that the front of the hull could withstand a firing of a 7.62mm rifle at 100 meters, but the side and rear of the hull were basically equivalent to running naked. If the weakness of the armor is a last resort for mobility, then the results of this driving test also weren't very good. The top speed was around 60 kilometers an hour, but the driving itself was very bad. The driver had to correct the direction several times while driving because the center of gravity of the chassis was tilted to the right. The domestic TZ2120A gasoline engine was liquid-cooled, which overheated many times during the driving test, and the vehicle had no floating capacity at all. So the WZ-141, which was troubled with the mobility subject, it also had a big flaw in the shooting part too. First of all, the muzzle velocity of the shell of the Type 75 recoilless gun was way too low. The trajectory was incredibly curved, and therefore there were certain problems with range and also accuracy. The second was that the gun had a long firing and reloading step, and it would take even a skilled operator more than a dozen seconds to fire the next shot. The old problems of recoilless guns, the storm of the tail of the gun, and the obvious sound like flame characteristics also naturally were a problem. The Airborne forces made 2-handed preparations, improving the existing prototype on the one hand, and then also building a second prototype on the other. So let's start with prototype 1, which after a few improvements was again tested for more than 1,000 kilometers of driving. While some driving problems were solved, the problem of overheating, lack of power, and also reliability in the engine was not solved. So in such a situation, a second prototype was built. This one changed the design of the prototype quite aggressively, and also boldly adopted a large number of new technologies such as foreign engines. It actually used the German F6L413F air-cooled diesel engine. It also used dual-flow dynamics, liquid pneumatic suspension, and automatic track hydraulic adjustment systems. Although the German diesel engine was larger and heavier than the domestic gasoline one, the second prototype was forced to redesign the chassis, mainly by adding an air intake to accommodate the air-cooled diesel engine, but the original engine overheating problem was solved. Reliability also increased a lot, and the increase in unit power had also led to a speed of 80 kilometers an hour. What's more, fuel consumption was in a much better state, and for the WZ-141, the longer travel per unit of fuel also indirectly reduced the weight of the vehicle and saved tonnage for other subsystems. There were also some changes in the armament. First of all, the 2 seatless guns that were originally symmetrically arranged are now all installed on the right side of the turret, which improved the difficulty of aiming the gun for the commander, but the center of gravity of the vehicle, which was already tilting to the right, would now be even worse. It turned out that such an improvement did not reduce the difficulty of reloading, and the reload time for shooting was still incredibly long. The HJ-73 anti-tank missile remained the same, but the Type 77 machine gun was replaced by a lighter Type 56 7.62mm machine gun. However, the advantages of the liquid pneumatic suspension were evident. When the vehicle chooses the right hilly surface for cover, the firing angle can be improved to adjust the height of the vehicle, which was the range of the adjustment was 170mm to 400mm. And ideally, the vehicle would be able to shoot only with the barrel of the gun and the launcher of the anti-tank missile. so therefore it greatly protected itself and improved the survivability of the vehicle. Unlike several projects of the Army of the same period, which were completed but still had some issues, the fate of the WZ-141 Airborne Combat Vehicle can be described as pretty much tragic. Tested at the end of the 70s, it soon saw the reform and opening up of the motherland and the consequent 6th five-year plan, helpless choice. At that moment, when all major branches of the armed forces were grabbing the cake, even the main air force had not forced to dismount several projects, and also the airborne troops under the shadow of the air force naturally couldn't even drink the soup. The WZ-141 was tested on the ground with an AN-12 in 1980 and then hasn't been used since. On the one hand, there was a shortage of funds for the project, and on the other hand, the airborne troops in the early 80s also saw the new airborne theories and equipment of the West and began to think about their own positioning and tactics in the new era. Then the WZ-141 seemed outdated and then out of place, and the whole project ended forever in 1985. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank GMG Smiley, CD Beans, Chieftain Mike, EMN3 Galaxy, Tulio Pontecorvo, Brendan Quinn, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Ozzy Panzer, Alan Hacker, Liam Shear, Opium Prime, Lafouche, Sem Aslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.